Here is a question that will make you deeply uncomfortable if you have ever prayed and heard nothing back. What if the silence was never God abandoning you? What if it was the single most loving thing He has ever done for you? C.S. Lewis, the man who wrote children into a wardrobe and gave demons a voice in letters, spent the final years of his life wrestling with a belief so unsettling that many of his own readers refused to accept it. He did not just suggest that God allows silence. He argued that silence is not the absence of God's love, but the clearest proof of it. And by the time you understand why, you may never experience an unanswered prayer the same way again. Stay with me, because the story of how Lewis arrived at this belief is not theory. It is one of the most brutal personal tragedies you will ever hear, and it very nearly destroyed his faith before it rebuilt it into something unshakable. Most people know C.S. Lewis as the man behind Narnia, the lion, the witch, the wardrobe, the talking beavers, the children who become kings. But before any of that, Lewis was one of the most feared debaters at Oxford, a man who had built his entire identity on logic, on argument, on the idea that you could reason your way to any truth if you were disciplined enough. He was an atheist for most of his early adult life, and not a quiet one. He mocked belief. He considered faith a comforting lie that intelligent people eventually outgrew. And then, in what he later called the most reluctant conversion in the history of England, he became a Christian, dragged there, in his own words, kicking and screaming. So when Lewis eventually wrote about God, people trusted him precisely because he had not started as a believer. He had started as the skeptic in the room, which is exactly why what happened to him later carried so much weight. Because the man who explained God to millions of readers was about to experience something that no amount of logic could explain away. Here is the part almost nobody expects. Lewis did not build his theology of silence sitting comfortably in a study surrounded by books. He built it standing at the edge of the worst grief of his life. For most of his adult years, Lewis lived as a bachelor, content in his rituals, his pipe, his long walks, his letters. Then, in his 50s, something happened that reshaped everything. He met an American writer named Joy Davidman, sharp, funny, relentlessly intelligent, someone who could match him, argument for argument in a way almost nobody else could. What began as friendship became something neither of them expected. They married. And for a brief, almost unfairly short window of time, Lewis experienced a kind of joy he had spent his whole life writing about, but had never actually lived. Then Joy was diagnosed with bone cancer. If you think you know where this story goes, wait, because it gets darker before it gets meaningful. Lewis prayed. Of course he prayed. He had spent decades telling other people how to pray, what prayer meant, why it mattered. He believed with total intellectual conviction that prayer worked, that God listened, that faith moved something in the unseen world, and for a while it seemed to. Joy went into a remission that her doctors could not fully explain. Lewis, the great rational apologist, allowed himself to believe that this was an answer, a direct and personal one. They had a few more years together. Then the cancer came back, and this time there was no remission. Joy died in 1960. What happened next is the reason this whole belief exists, and it is the reason so many people have found Lewis's later writing more powerful than anything from his earlier, more confident years. After Joy's death, Lewis did something almost no famous Christian writer of his era dared to do publicly. He kept a private journal of his grief, raw, unfiltered, furious in places. And he eventually published it under a pseudonym because he did not want people to associate this level of doubt with the man who had written so confidently about faith. In that journal, later published as A Grief Observed, Lewis described turning to God in his darkest hour and finding, in his own words, not comfort, not an argument against belief, but something worse: silence. He described it as feeling like a door slammed shut in his face, followed by the sound of it being bolted from the inside. Not cruelty, exactly. Something colder. Absence. Sit with that for a second, because this is the turning point of the entire story. The man who had spent his career explaining God to skeptics was now standing in the wreckage of his own faith, and God was not saying anything. If the story ended there, it would simply be a tragedy. A brilliant man's faith cracking under the weight of grief. Exactly the kind of story that atheists of his era pointed to as proof that belief collapses the moment it meets real suffering. But that is not where Lewis's story ends. And this is the part that even his critics have to reckon with, because what Lewis did next was not abandon the silence. He turned around and stared directly into it, and he refused to look away until he understood what it meant. Here is where it gets genuinely strange and genuinely controversial, because Lewis's conclusion was not the comforting one people expected from him. He did not say, after time passed, that God had actually been speaking all along, and Lewis simply had not been listening hard enough. He did not retreat into easy platitudes about everything happening for a reason. Instead, Lewis arrived at something far more unsettling and, to many believers, far more offensive. He suggested that the silence itself, the terrifying door-bolted silence he experienced after Joy's death, was not a malfunction in his relationship with God. It was, in some strange and difficult way, the relationship working exactly as it was designed to. Before you decide that sounds like cruelty dressed up as theology, let me walk you through how he actually got there, because the logic is more devastating and more strangely comforting than it first appears. Years before Joy ever entered his life, Lewis had already written about something he called undulation, a term he used in his fictional work about a senior demon mentoring a junior one in the art of corrupting a human soul. In that book, the demon explains that human beings and human faith naturally rise and fall like waves. There are seasons of intense spiritual feeling, moments when belief feels vivid, alive, almost undeniable. And then there are long, dry stretches where nothing feels true, where prayer seems to go nowhere, where the emotional warmth of belief simply evaporates. The demon in the story is delighted by these dry spells, because he assumes they are the moments when a person is most likely to give up entirely. But here is the twist Lewis embedded in his own fiction years before he lived it himself. The demon's mentor corrects him. He explains that God, whom the demons refer to only as the enemy, actually values the dry seasons more than the emotionally vivid ones, because during the dry seasons, a person's obedience and love are no longer being propped up by good feelings. They are being chosen freely, without any reward of emotional comfort attached. Let that sink in, because this is the actual foundation of Lewis's controversial belief. If God spoke to you constantly, if every prayer produced an immediate, undeniable goosebump-inducing response, your belief would not really be faith anymore. It would be closer to something automatic, almost mechanical, a reaction to stimulus, rather than a genuine choice. Lewis believed that real love, the kind that means something, has to include the possibility of walking away. And the only way to preserve that possibility, the only way to make faith actually free rather than coerced, is for God to sometimes step back and let the silence stand. Not because he has stopped caring, but because caring in a way that overwhelms your ability to choose is not actually love at all. It is control. And Lewis, of all people, a man obsessed with free will his entire career, could not accept a version of God who ruled through overwhelming displays of presence, rather than through respecting a person's freedom to doubt, to struggle, and to choose belief anyway. But this raises an obvious, painful question. And if you are watching this and you have ever felt genuinely abandoned by God during a crisis, you are probably already asking it. If the silence is really about respecting freedom, why does it have to feel so much like punishment? Why does it have to feel, as Lewis himself described it, like a slammed and bolted door rather than a patient, gentle absence? This is where Lewis's belief becomes even more controversial, because his answer was not to soften the pain. It was to insist that the pain was, in some strange way, necessary. He used an analogy that unsettled a lot of his readers, comparing God's silence during suffering to a father teaching a child to walk. At a certain point, if the father continues holding both of the child's hands forever, the child never actually learns balance. The father has to let go, has to allow the child to wobble, to fall, to feel that terrifying absence of support, because that is the only way real strength develops. Lewis was not saying suffering is good. He was saying that the silence surrounding suffering is not proof that support has vanished. It is proof that something is being built that could not be built any other way. Stay with this a little longer, because there is a deeper layer to this that most summaries of Lewis's work skip entirely, and it is the part that makes this belief genuinely radical, rather than just another comforting explanation for pain. Lewis did not believe silence was only about building strength or character. He believed it was actually a test of motive, a way of separating people who wanted God for what God could give them from people who wanted God for who God actually was. In one of his most quietly devastating observations, Lewis pointed out that it is remarkably easy to love someone or something when they are constantly rewarding you for it. It is far harder and far more revealing to remain loyal to someone who has gone completely silent. Think about what that means applied to faith. If God answered every prayer instantly, and obviously you would never actually know whether you loved God or whether you simply loved the results. The silence, in Lewis's framework, strips away every reward, every comfort, every emotional payoff, until the only thing left is the raw question underneath everything. Do you still choose this, even when it gives you nothing back? Even when it feels like nothing is listening at all? This is the point where a lot of people, including many devoted believers, start to push back hard on Lewis, and it is worth pausing to take that pushback seriously, rather than dismissing it. Because there is something deeply uncomfortable about telling a person in the middle of unbearable suffering that their pain might actually be a kind of gift. It can sound, if handled carelessly, like an excuse for cruelty, like a way of dodging the very real question of why an all-powerful, all-loving being would allow devastating silence in the first place, rather than simply comforting the people who need it most. Lewis himself understood this objection better than almost anyone, precisely because he was not writing this from a safe theoretical distance. He wrote it after watching his wife die slowly and after experiencing, firsthand, exactly the kind of silence he was trying to explain. He was not lecturing from a pulpit. He was describing what he had lived through and admitting, honestly, that even understanding the theology of it did not make the pain of it disappear. And this is where the real turning point of his belief comes in, the part that separates it from a simple platitude and turns it into something far more layered. Lewis eventually came to believe that the silence was not meant to be permanent, and it was not meant to be endured entirely alone. He compared periods of spiritual silence to something closer to weaning a child. A mother deliberately withdraws certain comforts, not out of cruelty, but because continuing to offer them indefinitely would actually stunt the child's growth. But weaning is not abandonment. It is a transition toward a different, more mature kind of relationship, one that does not depend entirely on constant reassurance. Lewis suggested that the silence many believers experience is not God disappearing from their lives forever. It is an invitation to develop a form of trust that does not need to be constantly fed by emotional confirmation. A trust that can survive absence. A trust that chooses to remain even when every immediate sense says it should not. If you are still listening, here is the piece that makes this belief genuinely controversial, rather than just poetic. Because Lewis took this one uncomfortable step further than most people are willing to go. He suggested that the silence itself might be one of the clearest signs that something real is actually happening, rather than a sign that nothing is happening at all. He compared it to the way a surgeon has to cause pain in order to heal, or the way a teacher sometimes has to withhold the answer in order to force a student to actually learn how to think, rather than simply memorize a response. In Lewis's framework, a God who never allowed silence, who constantly interrupted every doubt with instant reassurance, would actually be failing to give people what they most needed: the chance to develop a faith, a character, a love that was actually their own, rather than something borrowed from a constant stream of comfort. This is the belief that many of his critics found almost unbearable to accept, because it demands a level of trust that has nothing to lean on except itself. Now here is where this stops being a story about a British academic from the last century and starts being a story about you. Because chances are, if you have made it this far into this video, you already know exactly what this kind of silence feels like. Maybe it was a prayer you repeated for years that never seemed to change anything. Maybe it was a moment of crisis where you reached out, desperate for some sign, some feeling, some indication that you were not simply talking to an empty room, and instead you got nothing. Silence has a very particular kind of cruelty to it, because unlike a clear no, it leaves you unable to move forward or backward. You cannot fully believe, and you cannot fully walk away. You are stuck in the waiting room, and nobody tells you how long the wait is going to last. Lewis understood that waiting room better than almost any other writer of his generation, and this is why his conclusion carries so much weight. He was not asking people to pretend the waiting room did not hurt. He was suggesting something almost the opposite, that the ache of that waiting room is not proof that you have been forgotten. It might actually be proof that something significant is being formed in you precisely because nothing is being handed to you. Think about every meaningful skill, every real strength you have ever developed in your own life. Chances are, it was not built during the easy, comfortable seasons. It was built during the seasons where you had to keep going without anyone clapping for you, without anyone confirming you were doing it right, without any guarantee that it would work out. Lewis's radical claim is that faith works the same way. The silence is not the opposite of a relationship with God. It might be the very thing that makes the relationship real instead of performative. There is one more layer to this that Lewis added near the end of his life. After enough time had passed since Joy's death for him to look back at his own grief journal with slightly more distance, he noticed something he had not expected. The silence had not actually been permanent. It had changed shape over time, not because circumstances changed, but because his own posture toward the silence had changed. Early in his grief, the silence felt like abandonment, like a locked door. Later, without being able to point to a specific moment when it happened, the same silence began to feel less like an empty room and more like a waiting presence. Something patient rather than absent. Lewis was careful not to claim this shift proved anything objectively. He knew skeptics would say his grief had simply run its natural course and his brain had adjusted, nothing more. But he also refused to dismiss his own experience simply because it could not be proven under a microscope. He chose to trust that the shift meant something, even without demanding certainty about exactly what. This is ultimately why Lewis's belief about divine silence remains so controversial, even decades after his death. It refuses to give people the two easy answers they usually want. It does not say silence is meaningless suffering with no purpose, which would let people simply be angry and walk away with a clear conscience. And it does not say silence is not really happening at all, that if you just pray harder or believe more sincerely, you will always feel a comforting response, which would set people up for even deeper disappointment when the silence inevitably returns. Instead, Lewis asks people to sit inside the discomfort of not knowing, to keep choosing faith or love or hope, even while getting nothing back that confirms the choice was correct. That is an extraordinarily difficult thing to ask of anyone. It is also, according to Lewis, the only way any of it ever becomes real. Before we get to that final question, there is something else worth understanding, because it explains why Lewis's belief has quietly influenced so many people who never even read his theological work directly. This idea did not stay locked inside academic essays. It shows up, disguised, all through his fiction, and once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. Think about the children in his most famous stories, wandering into a strange new world through a wardrobe, expecting the great lion who rules that world to appear the moment they need him. Instead, again and again, the lion is absent for long stretches, unseen, unheard, while the children have to make difficult choices completely on their own, without any visible guidance at all. Lewis was not simply writing an adventure story. He was quietly rehearsing the exact theology he would later live through in his own grief, years before he ever experienced it personally. The lion's absence was never meant to signal that the lion had stopped caring. It was meant to show that courage, loyalty, and love only mean something when they are exercised without a guarantee of rescue. This pattern shows up again in the way Lewis wrote about prayer more broadly, not just during crisis, but in ordinary daily life. He once compared unanswered prayer to a child asking a parent for something the child does not yet understand is harmful, or asking for something the parent already intends to give, but not yet, not in the way the child is imagining it. Lewis was careful never to claim this explained every instance of suffering, because he thought that kind of tidy explanation was dishonest, a way of pretending pain made sense, when sometimes it simply did not. At least not from where we stand. What he insisted on instead was something more modest and, in a strange way, more demanding. He insisted that the absence of an answer is not the same thing as the absence of attention. A parent can be fully present, fully aware, fully devoted, and still choose not to intervene the moment a child wants them to. That choice can look, from the child's limited point of view, exactly like abandonment. Lewis's entire argument rests on the possibility that our point of view, in the middle of suffering, might be exactly that limited. Think about how this plays out for people today, in ways Lewis could not have imagined, but would probably have recognized instantly. Someone loses a job they prayed to keep and hears nothing but silence for months while bills pile up. Someone watches a marriage fall apart despite years of prayer for it to hold together. Someone sits beside a hospital bed asking for healing that never comes. In every one of these situations, the silence is not abstract. It is not a theological puzzle to be solved from a comfortable armchair. It is a lived, physical, exhausting reality, and telling someone in the middle of it that the silence might be meaningful can feel, if timed wrong, almost insulting. Lewis knew this better than most, which is exactly why he refused to offer this belief as a quick fix or a tidy bit of comfort to hand someone mid-crisis. He offered it only as something he had earned the right to say after living through the worst of it himself. And even then, he offered it quietly, almost reluctantly, more as an honest report from inside his own grief than as advice for anyone else's. So here is the question this leaves you with, the one Lewis never fully answered because he believed it was not his to answer for anyone else. If silence is not the end of the relationship, but possibly the very thing shaping it into something stronger, what does that mean for the silence in your own life right now? The prayer that never got answered the way you wanted, the waiting room you have been sitting in for longer than you ever expected. Lewis would not tell you the pain is not real because he lived that pain himself, standing in the wreckage of the person he loved most in the world, hearing nothing back from the God he had spent his life defending. But he would ask you to consider one more possibility before you decide the silence means nothing at all. What if the door was never actually bolted from the other side? What if it was simply waiting for you to knock again?